It's been a while. I'm going to cut right down to the chase. At the beginning of the year, my dog died. It was unexpected. There were no signs. He was fine one morning until suddenly he wasn't that night, and unfortunately we had to say goodbye to him a couple of days after that. It was my first time having to say goodbye to a dog. I didn't have dogs growing up, and so when I became an adult and began living on my own, I took in one dog and then another and then another. Digby, he was the baby of the family. When he died, I just wasn't handling it well. When I started this channel, I decided ahead of time to have a certain degree of privacy about my life, right? Like, this is a channel about books. I'm here to talk about books. But when he died, it felt like every other thought that I had was tinged with the pain of losing him. I was just totally unprepared for the toll it would take on my life. And also, it just didn't feel right to come to a relatively new platform where we're basically strangers and you're here for books. And I'm like, by the way, I'm fucking devastated right now. It just felt too raw, too vulnerable to have on top of everything else at the time. And so I made the decision to take YouTube off my plate, and I hope you understand. In recent months, I've been thinking more and more often about if and when I'd come back here and continue, but the more time passed, the more it felt like I needed to address the reason I took a break to begin with. Simultaneously, in processing my grief, I turned back into books about dogs specifically, and for me, reading these books about dogs was a way for me to share my grief with someone in a more private way. And now, with time and with healing, I feel ready to talk about not just my dog, but also these books. I ended up reading 8 books about dogs over the span of a couple of months, and in this video I'm going to rank them from my least favorite to my most favorite reads. I'm going to talk about plot, my thoughts in general, and there will probably be some spoilers, like whether or not the dog dies, but I don't think that the spoilers I do share would make or break your enjoyment of these books. Also, full disclosure, I am honestly just going with my heart on these rankings more than any other metric. This is clearly a self-indulgent video, but it's for me and my processing. And if I have learned anything from owning dogs just by their inherent state of being, it's to follow your heart, and that being sometimes the best way forward. Inside of a Dog is a nonfiction book about dog behavior. The author goes over a dog's different senses and how those senses relate to their perception of the world. The author also spends some time refuting common theories, like the idea that humans must maintain alpha status for their dogs, as if we were operating like a pack. I don't have a lot to say about this book, which is probably why it's on the bottom. It was a bit boring. I don't think I learned anything substantially new. The writing was a bit dry and clinical. I do think for someone new to researching dog behavior, this might be a decent read, especially because there is so much misinformation on the internet to sort of sort through. But for me, I read it, it was fine, but it's also on the bottom. Some of you might recognize the title of this book because of the 2008 movie adaptation that was released on Christmas Day and broke box office records while simultaneously breaking the hearts of thousands of children whose parents didn't realize that, spoiler alert, the dog dies at the end of this story. Yeah, what a way to spend Christmas. Well, the book and movie beats are similar enough with the same ending. This is a nonfiction book, autobiographical, following John Grogan and his dog, Marley. So Grogan and his partner are both journalists who decide to purchase a Labrador Retriever puppy as sort of a practice run for having a child, which is just the beginning of a series of questionable decisions these two make when it comes to dog ownership. This book spans over Marley's life from being a puppy to the end of his life as it coincides with the Grogans and their own growing family, with special emphasis on Marley's shenanigans. This book is fairly short, it was easy to read, and there were parts of it that I did enjoy despite there being an abundance of cliches and being a more superficial retelling of their life. It's when I start to think about the book more deeply where it'll just kind of falls apart. The Grogans purchased Marley from a backyard breeder, and this is self-professed, right? But more in retrospect. So they basically do zero research on the breeder or the breed, which, you know, for the book being almost 2 decades old and Marley being a 90s baby, I get that you don't know what you don't know. But I bring these points up because Grogan labels Marley as the world's worst dog. Like, it's literally in the title. And I guess I just feel like a lot of the shenanigans and behavioral issues that they describe in the book are understandable when you consider his origins and the lack of proper knowledge or training from his owners and, you know, any kind of mitigation on their part. And I guess it's just hard for me to feel sorry for irresponsibility. I wonder if maybe this is just one of those books that isn't aging well because Grogan writes like a man of his time, both in the language he uses and the way that he views the world, and it's just a little bit harder for someone like me to relate to. There's a point in this book where John's wife is clearly struggling in postpartum and is like, this is too much. The kids are too much. This dog is too much. I want to rehome this dog. And I think that the reader is supposed to be like, oh no, not Marley. But, you know, in a way I was kind of like, maybe you should. I'm personally ready for this dog to be a priority in somebody's life, but hey. Anyways, the ending is touching. It is. And I understand more than ever the pain of losing a dog and wanting to find meaning from their short lives, right? So ultimately, that is the reason this book is not at the bottom of the list. The Art of Racing in the Rain is a fiction novel told from the perspective of a dog. So Enzo is a mixed breed dog whose mental voice is poetic and wise, and he yearns for his next life, reincarnated as a human. So his motivation in his current life in his dog form is to learn everything that he can about the human condition, and he does so as witness to his owner, Denny's life as an up-and-coming race car driver. Enzo watches Denny fall in love, get married, start a family, suffer from loss because of cancer, and have to fight a pretty ugly child custody battle of his only daughter. Enzo does die at the end of the book, and for full disclosure purposes, this book does handle numerous heavy topics. Like, it's terribly sad at times. Overall, though, I did think the book was well written and definitely a step above in terms of craft when compared to other books in the genre, and I think Enzo is a lovely character. Denny, on the other hand, I enjoyed this book mostly, okay? Like, some of it was beautifully written and I connected with on an emotional level, but, you know, there were some other parts of it that I do feel like were a bit flowery, bordering on pretentious. This book was adapted into a movie in 2019, and I have watched that movie, and there were certain decisions that the filmmakers made about the plot that I just think were huge improvements compared to the book. Like, if you've read the book and watched the movie, you probably know what I'm talking about. I don't really want to get into the specifics here, but I can tell you about a review that I read about this book after the fact that I don't disagree with, right? This reviewer called this book basically a man's book about the male fantasy, and I just don't think that's wrong. So these memoirs tell the author, Brianna Mattia's story and her self-proclaimed unconventional life. After finishing these books, I feel like I need to give some backstory because it turns out, unbeknownst to me, that the author and these books actually come with some internet controversy. So I actually found the second book out in the wild. I was traveling and I saw it at one of those overpriced airport shops. I was drawn to the cover. It had a woman and her dogs, and I was like, great, I'm reading books about dogs right now. So I pick it up, I read the back, realize it's a sequel. I end up Googling the first book and read the synopsis, and I'm like, oh, okay, this seems like a story about a woman who goes into nature to find herself, right? With dogs. And I like that genre of books in general. So I, didn't think much more beyond that. I added the first and the sequel to my library holds and promptly forgot about them until they came available several weeks later. Nowhere Very Long gives insight into Madia's upbringing, her family, and what led her to this decision to load up herself and her dogs into this orange van Bertha and travel throughout the canyons of Utah. The first part of the book, I thought, okay, This author is engaging, this story is easy to read, and despite having a relatively tame and privileged background, I found her to be a decent storyteller. It's not until pretty deep into the book she kind of glosses over the fact that she's an Instagram influencer and that's how she's funding this lifestyle. And I remember being like, oh, okay, that makes sense, I guess. And as you continue on in the story, you kind of come to realize that this whole online influencing thing is actually a large part of the story and her identity. It just feels like it goes from 0 to 100 with what felt like a lot of time being spent online talking about the internet or defending herself against what I can only assume are criticisms she's received or justifying a series of poor decisions. Keep in mind at this point, I still have not looked up anything about this author or her backstory. I'm just basing this off of the way she's written this book. By the end, I felt pretty conflicted. Like, it just felt a bit of a mess. I don't know if I would have read the second book if it weren't for the fact that it conveniently came in shortly after I finished the first, and I was in between other library holds, and, you know, there was a part of me that was invested in the well-being of her dogs and kind of finding out what happens to them. And I think I've mentioned before on this channel that one of my character flaws is being a completionist, even if it's to my detriment. So I ended up reading the second book. Never Leave the Dogs Behind continues Madia's story post-divorce. She's no longer traveling in her van. Instead, she's living on this large plot of land that she bought in this trailer that has no electricity or running water. And she's got these 4 dogs running around, and she's clearly struggling with her mental health. Like, huge trigger warning for suicidal ideations. That's a large part of this book. I felt similarly about this book as I did the first, right? There were some parts that were beautifully written, engaging descriptions. I do think she's an above average writer. At the same time, I felt like we spent even more time online in this book than we did the first. Again, keep in mind, I still have not looked into this influencer or any of the controversy on my own, so the only thing that I'm going off of is what she's presenting in these books. She spends a lot of time talking about Reddit, and I get this impression that a lot of the book was to sort of be her opportunity to refute the Reddit haters and any sort of general criticism, which, you know, it is what it is. That's her truth, right? Anyways, I finished it. It was interesting. It was decently written. And, you know, by the end of the second book, I was curious. This lady wrote 2 books, spent a lot of time talking about what the internet was saying about her. So I was like, okay, what is the internet saying about her? I truly do not want to go into it too deeply here. But, you know, if you know, you probably know. If you don't know and you want to look into it, warning, it is quite the rabbit hole of lies, alleged scams, doxing, death threats, parasocial relationships galore. It's a lot. What I will say about complicated stories like this one, where there are multiple sides, the truth and who is right and who is wrong is generally somewhere in the middle. I guess I'm just personally uncomfortable with aligning myself one way or the other when I'm reading about what's happened in retrospect. And clearly, all of this has had a profound impact on Madia's mental health, and she is still clearly working through it. At least one of my biggest takeaways about the second book is that this is someone who is clearly still in a lot of pain and processing. Overall, would I recommend these books? Maybe. If they existed in a vacuum, I don't know. I liked how much time she spent around her dogs and their personalities, although, warning, her pet ownership style is definitely unconventional and at times controversial. I do think these books humanize a complicated and interesting person who is also a successful online influencer. I also think that if you don't like her at all, that these books aren't going to change your mind. You're probably going to find them defensive and not taking much accountability, right? For me, I'm torn. There's a point toward the end of the second book where she comes to this realization that if she does go through with taking her own life, there would be nobody left to take care of her dogs, and that she'd be leaving them behind. And I do think that was a profound and vulnerable thing to admit that I personally connected to on a deeper level. I think I'm just going to leave it at that. Because of Winn-Dixie is a middle grade fiction novel about Opal, a preacher's daughter who moves to a new town in Florida with her father. There, she makes new friends, notably a stray dog that she finds in this local grocery store and subsequently becomes his new name, Winn-Dixie. One of Opal's main struggles in the book, beyond just kind of finding her place in this town, is dealing with the absence of her mother in her life. So this was another book that I read while waiting for another library hold to come through. The edition that I read was a revised edition that included an author's note where she talks about how they removed some problematic passages and references. I remembered reading this in elementary school and having fond memories of it. Probably because as a petless child, I hoped and prayed that I would randomly be blessed with a stray animal to call my own. That didn't end up happening, but I do remember enjoying this book. This book was simple, cute, charming, and I think what I appreciated most was the ability to sort of revisit a place of comfort from my childhood. It reads like middle grade and is formatted as such in both length and complexity, so with that in mind, it was a pleasant read for me. Does the dog die at the end of this book? Actually, the dog dies over and over and over and over again. No, seriously, that is the plot. The story is told through Bailey, the dog's point of view, as he's reincarnated multiple times, along the way learning not just what it means to be a dog, but a good dog, and discovering his true purpose in life. This book was also adapted into a movie in 2017. There's actually quite a few differences between the book and the movie, but I would say that the core of both are the same, and I personally enjoyed both. Where the art of raising in the rain is told through a serious and philosophical canine narrator, a dog's purpose doggy narrator embodies a more childlike persona that lends itself to the sentimentality of the story. I do think that the stylization requires a certain amount of buy-in from the reader to actually enjoy, but I bought in, I enjoyed it, I cried, I laughed. Is it campy? Yes, it's so campy. But sometimes that's exactly what I'm looking for, and I enjoyed this book. At the very top of this list is Dog Songs by the late, great, Pulitzer Prize winning American poet Mary Oliver. I love Mary Oliver, I love poetry, and I love dogs, so it's absolutely a surprise to nobody that I adored this book. Oliver uses poetry and essays to describe these different moments with the various dogs she's known throughout her life, as well as the general connection between humans and dogs and nature at large. This book was simple, joyful, lovely. I felt like this book gave me everything I was looking for when it comes to healing after losing my own dog. While clearly not all of the books on this list were my absolute favorite, I overall truly enjoyed this exercise. I found it not only helpful in my processing of my own loss, but also as a way to break my reading slump. I found after Digby had passed that I was having a hard time sort of doing the things that I had enjoyed. He was a part of reading for me. He was the kind of dog that, wanted to curl up in your lap while you read a book. So, I was glad to take this time to sort of focus in on something that I love, which are dogs. Dogs live such short lives relative to humans, and it was both validating and comforting to sort of witness these lives living on through the owners that love them in these stories. Making this video seemed like a good way to sort of tie it all together, to be self-indulgent, to be unapologetically vulnerable with you and tell you where I've been. I want to conclude this video by sharing a passage from the end of Dog Songs. Because of the dog's joyfulness, our own is increased. It is no small gift. It is not the least reason why we should honor as well as love the dog of our own life, and the dog down the street, and all the dogs not yet born. What would the world be like without music or rivers or the green and tender grass? What would this world be like without dogs?